Hi, I'm Sarah McGee, and on behalf of some other teammates from a class we took, I'll be presenting about our research about food waste reduction at Utrecht University. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I'm sure everyone has at least some sort of experience or knowledge about food waste, but to put some numbers to it, the FAO estimates that about a third of all food produced globally is wasted or lost. And this accounts for about 32% of all the food that is produced. The environmental impacts are obviously quite extensive. Through lost food production, it amounts to about 3.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually, which is just a little bit less than the number of total emissions in carbon dioxide by the US and China put together. The water footprint annually is about 250 kilometers cubed, which is more than the discharge of the Danube River annually. Of course, besides this, there's a loss of biodiversity through the use of fertilization, eutrophication of lakes through the use of artificial fertilizers, and soil degradation through land use change and bad agricultural practices. In addition to this, of course, there are many social impacts. You hear of 1 billion people going hungry, besides the fact that about 2,800 kilocalories of food per person per day is produced. So this signifies that the world hunger problem is not a problem of lack of production, but more of a lack of distribution and way too much waste. Our problem context for this specific research was at Utrecht University. Recently, a strategic plan was developed that aims to put all communication and business operations of UU in a sustainable framework. And one of the main tenets of this strategic plan is to make all business operations of UU fully carbon neutral by 2030. And one of the key offices on the campus that are very keen on helping with this is the Facilitator Service Centrum. And they were our clients for this project. And they oversee the two caterers that UU hires out London and Sodexo. UU spends around 1.5 million on food and beverages bought from Sodexo alone, and so the FSC is very curious about exactly how much food waste occurs at events through UU catering partners. In a preliminary study by the FSC, they found that about 40% of coffee is wasted at meetings. And this was just a very rudimentary 2-week study that they did by just pouring leftover coffee into liter jugs and measuring it. So based on that, they figured that it must be a much more widespread problem that extends to food, and that's where our team came in. So this brings us to our research question: how can food waste generation be reduced at Utrecht University? And for this, we had 3 methods. The first was quantification, and we asked employees of the catering companies to count the food waste through registration forms that we dropped off with them, and our research team also went and counted the waste ourselves. Then we calculated the environmental impacts using life cycle analysis literature to get the water and carbon footprints. And finally, we tried to determine socioeconomic context and causes by having interviews with the various stakeholders along the catering chain. So for the quantification, we had a 2-week data collection period, and we defined waste as what was ordered versus what was left over. We couldn't really count it as what was thrown into the bin, because oftentimes after an event, if sandwiches or whatever were left over, students come and take them, or departments put them in their lounges for people to come take. So yeah, we can't really follow a sandwich to the bin, so we just counted the percentage of what was left over. We focused on lunches and tea and coffee sets because we had a very short data collection period of 2 weeks, and so we couldn't count every lunch, every dinner, every buffet kind of formal setting, so we just focused on these more simple aspects. And this is an example of a Sodexo form that we would leave. And with Sodexo, they weren't willing to have their employees count the waste for us, and so we had to leave these forms at the events and have the attendees of the lunches fill it out. And of course, that brings kind of an experimental problem of the attendees being aware of the food waste problem and possibly changing their behavior. But we didn't really have a choice because Sodexo wasn't willing to count the waste for us. So to sort of circumvent that, we also went and counted ourselves at larger events to maybe try and balance out this experimental effect. And then Out London were very cooperative, and they just agreed to count everything for us. And after 2 weeks, we just went and picked up the forms from them. So our results, we just counted standard lunch packages. There's a whole Sodexo menu, but these lunch packages called basic or luxury A, B, or C represented 70% of all lunch orders during this period. So we felt confident that it was an accurate sample size for food waste in general at the university. We did have to extrapolate some data because not all the forms after every event were clearly filled out, either maybe because the attendees didn't see it or didn't have time to fill it out or just weren't interested, I'm not sure. And then Out London comparison wasn't possible because they didn't give us data about the original order size, just what was left over. So that was a little bit tricky. But this chart represents the Sodexo waste left over. And as you can see, it's about 20% across the board. Even though we did extrapolate, we used more on the conservative end, so we're pretty confident that it's either at around 20% or even higher. So for the water and carbon footprint, to calculate this, we counted the waste in units, not weight, but you need weight to calculate water and carbon footprints. So we were given the average weights of different like meats and cheeses and breads from Sodexo, and then we used different literature to find out the footprints and weights of different fruits and juices. And then because sometimes the people who were counting wouldn't count the sandwich by type, they would just say 4 sandwiches as opposed to like 1 meat, 1 cheese, 2, whatever. So then we had to calculate like a footprint for an average sandwich and kind of get this, more rounded number. But after all this, we came to that out of what we collected just over 2 weeks, the water footprint amounts to over 85,000 bathtubs of 80-liter size, and the carbon footprint amounts to almost 4,000 kilometers of driving. So the numbers were fairly easy because I was just getting our hands dirty, counting, then calculating afterwards in Excel and analyzing the data. But the socioeconomic side was a little bit more convoluted because, of course, this is the why of food waste and not just the how much. So for this, it's tricky because there are various stakeholders. Of course, there are those who organize the events, there are those who actually place the food order, there are those who supply the food, like the caterers, and there can also be third parties like FSC who maybe coordinates the events. A big problem is a hospitality mindset. People don't want to order too little. They're scared of not having enough, and so it's better to order more if the budget allows, which it normally does. Secretaries don't want to get in trouble by their bosses. Bosses don't want to look bad in front of clients, and so, this leads to too much being ordered. Of course, there's the idea that the customer is always right, and if a caterer sees that a client is ordering way too much, at a certain point they can't be too pushy and saying, oh, you've ordered too much, because in the end, if the client wants however much for 50 people, it's a business for the caterer, so they're not going to say no at a certain point. And on top of that, the food waste that occurs after it's been purchased doesn't count as food waste for the caterer because they only care about waste on the production side in the kitchens because that directly affects their revenue. In the end, they're a business, and so it's kind of out of their hands after it's been purchased. So they don't really care about that. In addition, there's poor communication among the stakeholders. For example, if a secretary orders sandwiches for an event of 50 people and then 10 people end up not being able to come and 40 people are only coming, then maybe the secretary won't find out in time and they won't be able to adjust the order. So that's a big problem. And then finally, there are legal issues tied to food. It's an EU law that food can't be out of a refrigerator for more than 2 hours before it has to be consumed. And this is something that, because it's an EU-wide law, caterers don't want to risk any foodborne illnesses. And a big suggestion that always comes up is why don't catering companies donate their extra food to homeless shelters or whatnot. But this goes back to this law, and they don't want to get tied up with legal issues. So of course, food is cultural, and not just in the Netherlands. I think Utrecht University can be considered its own culture, so we had to look at what occurs within the university itself. And for this, we talked to secretaries who order and the caterers who supply the food. So the secretaries actually give us quite a bit of information. One of them told us that the Sodexo catering menu doesn't actually list the exact amounts of food per order. And this is a problem because it means that Sodexo is actually deciding on their side what a portion is. And the secretary said that because she's been ordering for quite a long time, she knows patterns in her demographic and her clientele. So for example, if she has an event that has more men than women, she'll order more because they tend to eat more. If there are more students, she'll order more because they tend to eat more. But because they're not listed, she has to trust Sodexo's portion sizes, and they're not always accurate for the events she has. So that's something that she wished would be different. She also did something where she asked on the invites for these events if they wanted food, because if you're not expecting lunch to be there and you bring your own, then you're either wasting what you brought because you don't eat it and you eat what's provided, or you just waste what's already been provided. So yeah, that also can lead to double waste. And finally, we talked to a secretary who kind of showed us that ordering systems can be very different, because this particular secretary ordered for the same 24 people every time because they were exam proctors. So she would know exactly which exam proctors were going to which event and be able to order exactly, for example, 4 proctors are going here, I'm ordering 4 sandwiches. So that was very tailored, and she had almost zero waste because of that. So that made us realize that, of course, there are different ways of even ordering to begin with. On the catering side, we talked to the head caterer at Out London, and he said the main thing he thought was the problem was a communication issue. People maybe are afraid to even try to adjust their orders. He said that things like sandwiches are made fresh, they're relatively easy to adjust, and so if you get to an event and you realize you don't have enough, you should be able to pop to a kitchen and ask them to make a few more. And the other way around, if you decide or you realize that you have fewer people coming than you were expecting, you can ask them to make fewer sandwiches. But people don't even try to do this, so people don't know it's an option. And then finally, it should partly be the responsibility of the caterer to give portion recommendations, because in a way they are party planners and they've been doing this for a long time, and they know the patterns and they know kind of what's appropriate. He did admit that if a client was very, very adamant about having a certain amount of food, he wouldn't push it, because ultimately, it's the customer who wants what they want. But he did think that the caterer should give more advice and be more assertive about that. So finally, all of this led us to various solutions and products. On the ordering side, we developed quite an extensive workshop to be able to be given to them, with ordering tips that we kind of gathered from these secretaries that we had meetings with, so that they can be more efficient in their ordering. On the catering side, we developed kind of a list of recommendations that different caterers should fulfill if they want to be either potential future catering partners of the university, in the same way that something like a fair trade label has a list of standards that you must adhere to be a part of that label. We kind of helped the FSC come up with a list of criteria that a catering company should be able to fulfill if they want to be hired. And then finally, for awareness, we made this website, foodprint.ga, and there's a list of common lunch food items, and if you put in the amount on the side, the carbon and water footprints will pop up on the right-hand side, and then there's also a section that explains exactly how we came to these calculations. So as I said, we only had 2 weeks for all of this, as the course was 9 weeks total, and there were a lot of logistical problems to sort out before we could actually get to data collection. So because of this, there is a lot more room for further research in terms of maybe accuracy, but we are pretty confident that our estimates are on the lower end, so actual food wastage is probably much higher than what we were able to calculate.